Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lighthouse Quilters tonight. I'd like to thank you all for coming to hear our own Betty Suter speak. So I'm going to tell you how this came about. Last year, I was asked to be the VP of Planning and Programs, and I got the job in October of 2022. I needed to plan the year starting in October. So at the holiday party, I had made an announcement for everyone, if you knew quote speakers, someone you wanted to hear at the Guild, to let me know. And someone came up to me and whispered, "You should ask Betty Suter." And you know me, I'm up for a challenge. I don't mind. I'm not scared. So I said, okay. And I called Betty and I said, "Betty, would you be willing to speak with the Guild next year? Would you be one of my programs?" And she said, "Let me think about it." And so I had planned to call Betty. I was going to give her a week to simmer. But she called me ahead of time. And she said she'd do it. I was overjoyed. That was a meeting plan that I didn't have to think about. And the Guild hadn't heard Betty speak in ages. So I asked Betty, "What type of program would you like to do, Betty? Would you like it to be an intimate gathering with Guild members? You have a seat and chat with us, bestow on us all of your wisdom, or could I advertise it to the community and we would share you with the world?" And Betty said, "You can share me." So we got the word out, and I'm so happy to see so many to turn out tonight for it. Many of you know, many of you might not know, Betty is a founding member of Lighthouse Quilters Guild. Usually when I have programs, I research the person, do an introduction so that I can say a few things about them before they stand up. But as most of you know, Betty needs no introduction. Her work stands for itself. So please join me in welcoming Miss Betty tonight.
As a child, I learned how to sew on Mom's treadle sewing machine. I went with Dad to buy chicken feed so I could pick out 3 print matching feed sacks and I could make a skirt and a blouse. I was a stay-at-home mom for 15 years and I sewed and altered clothes for 60 people, including 3 wedding dresses from Sketches, bridesmaid dresses, and men's suits. In 1979, my grandma died, and while Mom was going through her attic, she found a small quilt top and gave it to me, saying, "I know if I give it to you, you'll make something beautiful out of it." And she even gave me a picture from Better Homes and Gardens magazines of a quilt. All I could see was ugly. The muslin squares were rain-stained, and none of the prints seemed to complement each other. I took them apart and washed them and used setting strips to make it big enough for my bed. Boy, did it get big. My first quilt was 110 by 130, and I didn't know the quilting stitch was a small running stitch. I used the punch and poke method of quilting, and it was a long, laborsome job. I talked my husband into helping me, and he did a better job than I did. It was the first and last quilt that I quilted on a frame, and the last quilting my husband did. I was hooked on quilting. By the way, I got 4 stitches to the inch. I decided I needed to learn a trade so I could help get our boys through college without a debt. I was teaching sewing at Gateway Technical College and was asked to teach quilting. All I could say was, "I don't know how to quilt." I took mechanical design at the same time, and I graduated with a scholastic honor, and years later was awarded the Distinguished Alumni Award for outstanding leadership and excellence in my field. I worked as a draftsman for 7 years, and this was a great advantage when I decided to design my quilts. I'm a self-taught quilter with a lot of confidence, patience, and determination to meet the challenge. I have a God-given talent. I am the artist, and my needle is my paintbrush. I asked one of the engineers to help me figure out how much fabric I would need to make a cathedral windows quilt for our son's twin beds. And I had enough material left over to make a third quilt. And that would have been all right, but I had it all cut into 8-inch squares, and I had 600 left over. Why would I doubt an engineer? I saw a picture of Ginny Byers' Ray of Light quilt and drafted the pattern. It didn't occur to me to just buy her pattern, but I learned a lot from the experience. My quilting stitches were generous, and I had the piecing under control, but struggled with the hand quilting. I thought it was pretty good, and I entered it in a local quilt show. Well, of course I didn't win, but I gained insight as to how to improve. I took the judges' critiques as a helpful hint and not criticism. The next quilt I entered in several shows and kept doing what the judges wanted, and eventually I started winning ribbons. This is the best way to get a personal evaluation of your quilt. In 1986, I designed Isometric 1, and I had a hard time deciding how to end it. The repeats were quite large. It's 105 by 121. At the show in Paducah, Kentucky, my award had been sponsored by Jeffrey Gutchin, whose company made the print fabric I used. He was very pleased, and I named Isometric 1 in case I wanted to make another. That didn't happen. And after an unsuccessful spine surgery that ended the 7-year career that I loved as a draftsman and was no longer able to sit at my sewing machine, I decided to do hand applique and hand quilting that I could do from a comfortable chair. In 1987, I decided to design an applique quilt. And this was my first original applique design, the first quilting design, and the first time I did trapunto. And I knew I would have to hand dye the fabric to get the 8 hues of each color, giving me the ability to get the shading I was looking for. I was able to take a hand dyeing class in Paducah to learn how. And dyeing fabric is not one of my favorite things to do, but so important to achieve my goal, needing the shading for my designs. In 1988, I entered Delectable Pansies in the National Quilting Association show in Little Rock, Arkansas, and won Best of Show over 400 quilts. You could have knocked me over with a feather. And this gave me the courage to submit my quilt for master judging in 1989 in Tacoma, Washington. I became the 9th master quilter in the world. There have been 36 awards given out. And Master Quilter is the highest honor the National Quilting Association could bestow. And to become a Master Quilter, the quilt is judged on its own merit by a panel of 4 certified judges at the annual NQA show. And they use a score sheet of 116 points, and they go down the list with pass or fail, with a possible score of 1 to 10. And I got a 10. And I had an opportunity to ask a judge how many quilts that are entered for Master Quilt are actually awarded, and he said less than 25%. And there's the center detail of my quilt, and I think you can see why I'm after the shading that I can get using all my different colors. And the leaves are also, I have 8 different shades for the leaves. And this quilt, on the bottom label is the one I put on when I made it. And the next one up was the Master Quilt Award label. And then above that one was the quilt registry. And then that quilt was sent to Japan And I had to put another label on saying that it was made in the United States to avoid having to pay a duty charge. That quilt got named real good. And this is my carpenter's wheel quilt. And I gave this one to my granddaughter Becky and her husband Dan for their wedding. And this is not my original design, it's just a pattern that's been around for years. But I had two pattern companies ask me if they could use my quilt for the cover photo for the pattern that they wanted to make. So I said, sure, that isn't my design anyway. This is Lilies of the Field I made in 1990, and it's 77 by 95 inches. This quilt has 3,697 pieces, with a flying geese border taking almost 1,000 pieces. To appreciate this, I did not know about the rotary cutter. So it was all cut with scissors and templates. And alternating with the piece blocks, I did trapunto blocks, and this is entirely quilted with a 1/4 inch grid. There's the flying geese border. And my sister Sandy came and took care of me twice following surgery, so that quilt went home with her, and it looks beautiful on her bed. In 1991, I made my last large pieced quilt. It's Jewels in the Desert, and it's 77 by 101. I had to fussy cut the fabrics for the center of the stars to get the design I wanted, and this was Heather and Drew's wedding quilt. I also made Bountiful Splendor in 1991. It's 79 by 109, and this was my 35th quilt. I had it all appliqued except for the butterflies on the handles of the basket, and I laid it on the floor, and I carefully laid a butterfly exactly on the handle. And my brother-in-law, George, said, "Butterflies don't do that." So I picked them all up and handed it to him, and he walked around the quilt and dropped them right where you see them, and he was so right. I'm very thankful he didn't like where I put them. And there's the center of the quilt. And this one, when I was doing the background quilting, I wanted the grid to look like a basket. So I quilted, my lines were 1/4 inch apart, and then 1/2, and then back to 1/4. And that's how I did that whole quilt in both directions. And there you can see the stylized heart in the corner and the ferns coming out of the heart. In 2002, I was a featured artist for Avenue of Quilts in downtown Racine, where all the quilts were in the store, all of the store windows had quilts in them. And my brother-in-law, Jim, took great delight in naming my quilts. And I was happy he wanted to, because then I didn't have to think of something. And when he named Aubusson Jardin Pardier, he thought it should have a French name, because Aubusson, France, is where this typical style of quilt was made. Or they were not a quilt, I'm sorry, a rug. So I asked my neighbor, who teaches French, how to pronounce it, and she said, well, it's something about a door. And Jim thought it was Aubusson Garden of Flowers. So we had a good laugh over the name he put on that quilt, but the name stuck. And this quilt was appraised at $58,890. And I can tell you these appraised amounts now because I no longer have the quilts. And this was the first quilt I needed to dye a 5-yard length of fabric, which means I had to lean over my laundry tub for 1.5 hours to keep that fabric moving to get my color even. But it worked. And the ivory flowers surrounding the center medallion were actually fruit, but the judges saw them as flowers, and they said I needed to put more leaves on my flowers. So even at this point in my quilting, I'm still listening to the judges. And the ivory areas are quilted in ivory thread, and the burgundy areas are quilted in burgundy thread. The stitches had to be perfect because the backing is ivory. And there's a design that I quilted in the body of the quilt. And this is the corner, and I used reverse applique on that border. And there aren't very many occasions when reverse applique works well. And for this one, to do reverse applique, I cut the top layer of fabric and turned it under so that the bottom layer of fabric would show. And here you can see how small my flowers are, and those stems are 1/8 of an inch. My brother Marty drowned saving his daughter's life 2 weeks before I finished this quilt. And on the back, under the label, I wrote a tribute to my brother Marty Eckern, 1945 to 1995. I didn't touch a needle or thread for 4 months after his death. I had no inspiration. In the first show I entered Aubusson Jardin Parterre in was in Pennsylvania. And I always had to send my quilt to the show, but usually we would go to the show and bring it home. But for this one, I decided to let them send it home to me. I waited a week and I called the Mancuso brothers and asked them where my quilt was. They set out a search for it and found they didn't use the return address label that I had sent with the quilt. And FedEx had picked it up and returned it to the hotel where they picked it up. Unfortunately, no one opened the box to see what was inside. There's always a risk when I send a quilt out. And when I sent this quilt to the AQS, I prayed, if I'm worthy, please let this quilt win. And win it did. In 1996, I won Best of Show at the AQS show in Paducah, Kentucky, with Aubusson Jardin Parterre. There were 1,078 quilts from 16 countries and 47 states, and I won the prize. Thank you. I had the choice of accepting the $15,000 award to put my quilt in the National Quilt Museum or keep my quilt. And I thought, $58,000, $15,000, I'm going to keep my quilt. And I was the first person to deny the award and keep my quilt. Mr. Schrader was shocked, and my husband almost died. And when I was there, a lady asked me how many hours it took to make my quilt. And I said, well, I can tell you months, but I can't tell you hours. And she spent 10 minutes scolding me and telling me that I had to keep track of hours because men evaluate art and men can only relate to hours. So each day I would write down the time I started, and when I got up, I'd write the time down, and at the end of the day, I tallied up my hours. It takes a lot of discipline, but it does work. And there I am in Paducah with my dozen long-stemmed roses, and they made me accept the check for the quilt, but after the ceremony was over, I gave it back. And this is my friends from Lighthouse. They honored Ron and I the next day when we got back home, and it was a Lighthouse quilting meeting, so I was very blessed. In 1998, there was a special exhibit at the National Quilt Museum entitled Tradition in Transition, and they asked me to loan Aubusson Jardin Parterre. Ginny Beyer had a special exhibit in Houston at the IQA show titled Tradition in Transition, and also asked to use my quilt. And I sat beside Ginny Byers at the awards ceremony at the IQA show. And she's just a plain old nice person, just like all of us are. It was fun. I was also named one of 30 distinguished quilt artists of the world for my body of work. 3 of my quilts were exhibited in Tokyo, Japan at the International Great Quilt Festival in 2002. The aim of this festival was to promote the art of quilting as a new lifestyle option for the 21st century. I received this picture along with a book of these quilts written in Japanese. And I was one of 7 quilters from the United States to represent the National Quilting Association at the 2002 World Quilt Carnival in Nagoya, Japan. I was at a show in Omaha, Nebraska, and a Japanese lady came over to me and asked if her mother could meet me. And I said, sure. So we met, and she bowed. She said, hello, the only English word she knew. And she wanted to come and be my apprentice for 3 months. And shocked, I said, no. But I did agree to let them come for 2 months. Not 2 months, I'm sorry, 2 weeks. And Junko, another daughter, wanted to come, and she wasn't able to get off work, so she quit her job so she could come and study with me. And Junko knew a few words in English. Noriko was our translator, but not a quilter, so she knew none of the quilting terminology. It was mostly teaching by showing, and the Japanese want to learn under one master. They were here on a 3-month visa, and we arranged so we could meet again in Paducah. And while they were here, we took them to church with us. It was cold and snowing, and they took off their leather coats and left them in the car. We didn't say anything, but we left our coats on. And we went to the contemporary service, and on the way out, they commented they had never heard a band in church before. And there were children sledding on the hill across the street from the church, and they were fascinated. So we sat there a while and let them watch. Todd's family came over for dinner, and so they could meet them. And Junko passed a bag of candy around, and Stephanie, age 8, said, "How can you read this writing?" It was all in Japanese. It was an interesting day for all of us. And while the Japanese ladies were here, 4 of my quilts were in Japan. And we met again in Paducah, where my quilt won the 2002 Best of Show Award with Welcome to My Dreams. And I declined that prize of $18,000. Poor Ronnie just shook his head in disbelief. And I explained it would be like selling one of my children after all the time I spent making it. And this is the quilt that I designed for the Japanese lady for their project when they came over. And there they are in Paducah, Ikuko on the left and Junko on the right. And this is Welcome to My Dreams. And this one is the one that won Best of Show down there. So they were thrilled to see that they got to study under me when I just won Best of Show. And there I am sitting with my quilt and talking to the people as they go by. And there's the corner detail, and I use 1/4-inch rod quilting on the border, and the rest of the quilt is 1/2-inch grid. And it gives you a good look at the flowers and how small they are. Those stems are 1/8 of an inch. And there's the side detail. And if you notice that straight strip that's right near the edge, that's a batik fabric. And I usually would start with a batik and take my colors from there. And then for this quilt, I added the pinks. And there's the other end of it. A lot of details on that quilt. And this shows my color palette with the lavender, gray, and brown. And I tried putting pink in there, and I didn't like it, so I took the pink out. And then the next one is the gray shadings going dark to light and back to dark again. And here I used lavender shadings on either side of that central design. And this is the center medallion of my quilt. And I think it speaks for itself as to why I want all those different colors. They just really blend and show off well. And when I'm working on a quilt, I never predetermine color placement. I put one flower in, and then I pick another one. And that's the way I choose to work. And there's the label. You might have figured out already, labels are important on your quilts. And I usually have leftover appliques, so that's what I put with them. And there we are, Ron and I and Ikuko and Junko in front of my winning quilt. This quilt, I'm going to tell you about how I get my designs. And I like this rug a lot. And I wrote to the rug company and asked permission to make a quilt from it, and they did grant it. If I had not gotten their permission, they could have sued me for copyright infringement. And the big shows are real sticklers about any of your designs if they're your own or if you got them from another source. This is my quilt made from that design. It looks nothing like it, but it is still basically their design. I changed all the colors, and I used all my own flowers, none of the flowers that were on that rug. And I'm not supposed to do that yet. You have to look at the quilt. Oh, we'll go ahead. This is the side, and I had that border print from, it was a Ginny Beyer print. It had different borders printed on that fabric, and I never quite knew what to do with it. And this quilt was screaming, use that border. And to make that curved piece on the end, I made a plastic template so I would know when I got it the right size. And on each flower, each design, in exactly the same place, I took a small dart until I got the curve. And to look at it, it looks as though I used a curved piece of fabric. And then that picture frame in the corner was a companion print to that one. And that frame is totally biased. I had no control over it. So I put freezer paper on the back side of it, and I appliqued the inner circle first, and then I took the freezer paper off, and I appliqued the outer edge. And the binding on this quilt was another border from that same piece of fabric, and it worked perfect for this quilt. And you see that pretty blue bow in the corner? The first one I put in there was pink, and it was Pepto-Bismol, look out. I couldn't stand it, so I took it off. And here is the center medallion, and again you can see the beautiful shading I'm getting from all my hand-dyed fabrics. And I like to use circles, and this quilt has a lot of circles in it. And that quilt that I just showed you was there was a 29-member panel of quilt experts participated in the ultimate quilt search to select the century's 100 best American quilts of the 20th century. My quilt, Floral Symphony, is one of them. I was in Houston at the International Quilt Festival and was able to see the 100 quilts on display, and I found it to be an outstanding exhibit. This quilt got first place at the AQS show, and while I was there, I met Gunsu Gungar, a delightful woman from Turkey. She sat on the floor beside me quite a while. In fact, she came back and sat by me 3 different times. And she said, when I look at your quilt, I feel closer to God. Now that's a compliment. I entered it in a show in Pennsylvania, and my friend was assisting in the judging. And she said the judge saw my quilt and said, another pink and blue quilt, and she walked on by without judging it. And I won the Viewer's Choice Award and a baby lock sewing machine that I sold for $950. And Orchid at Midnight, I made from my own photograph a pattern so I could make this quilt. And it's 17 by 24, made in 2011. And this was my 71st quilt. I gave the quilt to my granddaughter, Stephanie. When I showed her my other quilt, she'd say, "That's nice." And I showed her this one, and she said, "I like that one." So she got it. And now I want to show you how I go about deciding on a design. Now this rug on the floor was my inspiration, and my quilt doesn't look anything like the rug, but it gave me the idea to start. I also like this keyhole design on that piece of furniture. Let's see where I'm at here. This quilt is 80 by 80. There I'm drafting out the pattern on my drafting board. This is my pattern. I use the end roll of newspapers because it's a big piece of paper, and I draw it all out in pencil, and then I go over it with a Sharpie marker so I can see through I use a light box so I can see through the fabric. And I also drew out my quilting design. When I start a quilt, I leave nothing to chance. I know exactly what it's going to look like when it's finished. And that's the quilt I made, inspired by the rug and those keyhole designs. And the appraised value on this one is $26,000. I gave this quilt to my granddaughter, Christy, and her husband for a wedding gift. She was the only granddaughter interested in quilting and appreciates the work that went into it. And we spent a lot of time together. Even when she was in college, she'd take her spring break and come and stay with us, take Grandpa's chair, and she'd sit there and quilt. This is the center of that quilt. And see my keyhole? All around that circle. And I also like to do the shading from light to dark and dark to light as you go around. It just keeps your eye moving. And all of the flowers that you're seeing here are different. And there's that keyhole design again near the border of the quilt. And my corner, I like to use gray as a resting place for your eye. So you look at that corner with all those flowers, and I put gray above it, and then below both ends of it, there's another gray, and it rests your eye. And then that outer border, I'm again using my hand-dyed fabrics, light to dark and dark to light. And there's that keyhole again, and I put a teardrop right in the corner, and I thought that finished the design. And this is my trapunto. And when I do a trapunto, I draw the design on voile fabric, which is a very lightweight fabric, and I baste it to the back side of the top, and then I baste quilts the entire thing from the back side, so I have a pattern to follow on the top side, and I do the trapunto through the voile. So when I put all the layers together and do my quilting, for that design, I am quilting the basting lines that I quilted on there, and then when I get it all finished, I use a tweezer and take the basting stitches out. It's a long process, but it works, and I don't have a single mark on the top of my quilt. And there's the back, very heavily quilted, and that's typical of what the backs of my quilts look like. And there's a label with some more of my leftover appliques. I would like someone to hold up that big quilt on the end. That one. Bring it up here over the carpeting.
If I spoke with you before the meeting, could you come forward? If I didn't speak with you,
Come up here. I thought I had a sleeve in that quilt, but I didn't, so I can't hang it. Hold the top straight across. It's all right if it touches the carpet here. Okay, that is the pattern I drew to make this quilt. And I had that whole center design appliqued, and I was using a whole cloth, and I was not exactly straight. I was off just a little bit. And I had to have, if I can get up here, I'm hooked. Excuse me, I'm not used to being wired. Okay.
Yeah, we'll bring it to you.
That's all right, I'm here now. This line had to be exactly in matching up with that line, and I was off about a ½ an inch. So I cut the whole center out, and then I appliqued it on another piece of fabric that was supposed to be the backing, but I salvaged all my work, and things like that happen. This one took 7,700 hours over a period of 7.5 years. I was sick, and I couldn't work on it for a 1.5 years. But the designs on this one are small and intricate, taking a long time to make. And I never make anything fast or easy. And I was teaching at a guild in North Carolina, and a lady invited me to come to her house to see all the rugs she had bought while they were living abroad. And that was the idea for this quilt. Okay, you can show the back. If you're ever in doubt how much to quilt your quilt, quilt it some more. Okay, you can put that down. I don't want you to walk around with it. And let's see where I'm at here. This is Creation Springs Forth, and I'm sorry the podium's in front, but I had to be able to see over that to see that. And this quilt was, with me here. This is, I think, I can't even remember the name of this thing, Joy of Creation. Creation Springs Forth. I like this label. And I didn't even write it down here, but I can tell you, I wrote it on the back of the quilt. In 2011, this one was 3,630 hours. But again, here I'm using gray as a resting place for your eye, and also along the corner. And to me, it just balances everything out. And I love the trapunto quilting on here, and this is a very small trapunto area compared to the previous quilt. And I decided to make that 1,000,000 flowers around the border. It took a long time, but I like the way it looks. And now I want that big green one, and the top is what's right in your right hand there. This is all count cross stitch. You can let it touch the carpet. Drape it over the steps so they can see it. and hold the top out straight. I'm very picky. Okay, now they're ready, so I'm ready. In 1985, I bought a count cross-stitch and made the 12 monthly blocks plus the cover for sharing our love through the seasons. This quilt is 103 by 109. I had to use trigonometry to get the design to fit in the allotted space in the borders. When I was in school, I thought, when am I ever going to use this? Well, I used it. And Ginny Byers was doing a special exhibit on borders and asked permission to include my quilt. And Patricia Morris was putting together lectures on borders and also asked to use my quilt. So I'm finished with that one. Down, there you go. And now if one of you will go get the blue quilt. This is Rhythmic Hues, and it took 512 hours to make. It's entirely stipple quilted. The appraised amount on this one was $1,500, made in 2004. The National Quilt Museum had an anniversary exhibit with all the best of Showa quilts and wanted a companion quilt by the same maker in the museum. Although I had 2 quilts in the exhibit, I only made 1 companion, and I loaned my quilts to the museum for this exhibit. And this quilt hangs in my kitchen. If your arms get tired, you don't have to keep holding it up. There you go. And this one, I made that stylized trapunto design on either side of the corner. And here is this, you can see my small hand stitching. No longer getting 4 stitches to the inch. And there's my label. And also on this quilt, I want to show you how I block a quilt. I lay it on the floor, and you might be able to see the nice grid on my carpet. And I mist the quilt with distilled water, and then I take my hand and rub across it to get the water to penetrate the fabric. And then I take a towel and blot off as much of the moisture as I can, and I leave it lay there overnight. And now I'm ready for the next small quilt. I made that quilt, Poinsettia Princess, was made in a class by Phil Beaver, teaching us how to paint fabric. We used a foam paintbrush and fabric dye to paint with, and then put salt on the fabric and laid it on the floor to dry overnight. The second day, I cut and laid out my design, and because of the salt, I couldn't hand quilt it. Pat Berry machine quilted it, and then I washed it to remove the salt. Okay, the next one, please. This is Her Majesty, and I made this also using painted fabric and my foam brush. And to get that little fuzzy part on that petal, I took a yellow strip of fabric and I machine stitched it to the flower, and then I pulled all the lengthwise threads out, so what's left is the fuzz, and that's what I was looking for. I hadn't done that before, but it works really well. The next one, please. This is Flaming Lilies, and each of those lilies has almost 100 pieces in it. And this I worked off a photograph, and every time there was a color change, I changed the fabric. The next one, please. This one is Radiance Blooms. It's my 88th quilt. And I bought that fabric when I was in Paducah, and I just fell in love with it, and I wanted to make large flowers. So this is the quilt that I made from it. Okay, you're finished. Thank you. And now I would like to show you a few baby quilts. This was made for Ryan, and I like working with soft colors, which you probably already figured out. And then the next baby, his mom wanted primary colors in the same design, and it's mostly white, but I found that working with colors I don't like is like listening to music I can't stand. The quilt was cute, but I was glad when I was finished. And this one is Overall Sam. I always wanted to make that, excuse me. I always wanted to make an Overall Sam and a Sunbonnet Sue. And I'd always let the mothers tell me what they wanted. And then the last time I said, if it's a girl, I'm making Sunbonnet Sue. And she had a girl. Notice those bonnets around the border are really bonnets. And that quilt turned out so cute. This is the 30th anniversary of AQS, and they had almost life-size pictures of those quilts that were the 30 that won. And my quilts are in the second row. Third from the left is Aubusson Jardin Parterre, and second from the right is Welcome to My Dreams. I earned my fame working by myself in my basement sewing room and entering quilt competitions. My quilts have been in 14 books, 39 magazines, 7 calendars, and 2 AQS videos. I have won 48 Best of Show awards and 21 Best Workmanship awards. I recently cleaned out my cupboard and decided to throw my ribbons away. I stopped counting at 300, and I filled the bag, and I thought, this is pretty heavy, so I went and weighed it. I had 10 pounds of ribbons. I did keep about a dozen ribbons. And I'm fortunate that my niece insisted I keep a record of my quilts and pictures, and I resisted at first, not knowing where this new adventure would take me. Now I have volumes of information on my quilts, starting with my very first quilt. I met Margaret Docherty from England at one of the AQS shows, and she asked my permission to include Welcome to My Dreams in a book she wrote, saying that my quilts resembled those of the 1930s and will no doubt be seen in future generations as timeless beauties rather than one reminiscent of a particular era. And she also wrote, my quilts are astounding, flowing floral fantasies. Try saying that fast. I taught for guilds and conventions across the United States for 13 years. In 2014, I donated my 2 Best of Show quilts, Aubusson Jardin Parterre and Welcome to My Dreams, along with Floral Symphony, one of the 100 best, to the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. I decided they needed to be where people could see them. I'm the only one to have more than 1 Best of Show quilt made by hand in the museum. And I feel fortunate to have had the opportunity to meet quilters from around the world in my adventure as a quilter. Quilters have a strong bond with each other. Thank you for letting me share my quilting journey story with you. Thank you. Good.